My name is Katie, and I am going to go over how to assemble the front portion bodice of the new Sinclair Lotte pattern. This pattern is really great, has a ton of flexibility for color blocking, or you can make a solid option like I did here. So this pattern is drafted for medium to heavyweight fabrics, and so let's talk about the fit first. So the Sinclair Lotte has 8 inches of ease at the waist. This is a great amount of ease for a hoodie pattern. I really like the ease. It does not feel frumpy, but it also doesn't feel like it is too fitted. So I feel like it's a perfect midpoint, especially if we're using those heavier weight fabrics. So this Lotte that I have on right now is made out of pont. It would consider it a heavyweight fabric. It's thicker in structure, but it has great stretch to it. So keep that in mind when you're picking out fabrics. I've also used a French terry, which had less stretch to it, so it is a little bit more former fitting. For my case, I am 5'5", and I make the regular height pattern. So the first thing you want to do is figure out which size of pattern you need to make based on your height and or any adjustments that you normally make with your torso. So I have a standard size torso with an 8-inch side waist. I fit perfectly into the regular height patterns. You may be 5'5" also, but have a shorter torso or a longer torso and might need to make the petite or the tall versions accordingly. Do keep in mind though that the difference between the petite, regular, and tall patterns is not just in the bodice length. It's also adjusted in the arm side, in the shoulders, in pretty much the sleeve length. It's in everything. So keep that in mind when you're picking out which pattern file to start off with. The second thing you need to do is look at your measurements. This pattern, it is recommended to grade across the board. So for me, my base size starts at my bust. I have a size 6 bust, US size 6. I measure an 8 for the waist and a 6 for my hips. I did all of that grading. You're going to get the best fit if you're doing all of the grading onto your pattern pieces. It will allow for more movement, and it's going to hug how this pattern was drafted for. So a difference for me here is if I had just graded out to an 8 waist and kept the 8, then the bottom band wouldn't hug my hips as it does right now. It's not tight, but it's not loose. So that's gonna get me the more optimal fit. So how do you do that? The first thing you need to do is print, if you're grading, whichever sizes that you need. So I went on and I clicked the 6 and the 8 of the regular size pattern files and printed those off. Then I followed the directions in the tutorial on how to grade accordingly. You will need to grade a good majority of your pieces. So starting out, I know that I need to start with a base size of a size 6 for my bust. So my hood, my cowl, my drawstring, my sleeves, and my sleeve cuffs, as well as my front top panel piece, all are cut out with a size 6. Then I followed the tutorial and I graded for the right side panel, the pocket panel, and the left side panel, as well as the back piece, from a 6 at the top out to an 8 the waist and back in at the bottom to a size 6. I also cut out the bottom band as a size 6. So my pieces, you can see, have just a very slight out for the size 8. My piece might look a little bit different than yours. These are my pieces from testing, and I have not reprinted the final version, so I have a few markups of changes that I've made personally, but make sure to print the newest file. So now that you have all of your pieces cut out to the correct sizing, you'll need to cut out your fabric. So let's talk fabric. So for this version, am going to use different fabrics. I have a French terry here, a cotton lycra, and another French terry. I will also be using a cotton lycra for the inside of the pocket piece. So how do you decide where and what to do? So the first thing that you need to make sure you're doing is you are laying out all of your pattern pieces right side up. You need to do this for the front pieces to ensure that they all fit appropriately. So let me show you what the pattern pieces right side up are going to look like. Alrighty, so here is what the front pattern pieces look like. One thing that you need to make sure to do is cut them all with the right sides facing up. If you were to flip this over, your problem would be that when you're going to sew these together, they're not going to line up correctly and be the right orientation. If you would prefer for the diagonal to be the other direction on your body, you can simply flip all of the pattern pieces over and cut them with them being right side down. That is an option. It might be more confusing when you're following the steps on the tutorial. So with my right sides facing up, what I'm going to do next is cut out my fabric. At this point, what you're going to need is one main of your front top panel, each your left and your right side panels, and then the main of your pocket panel, as well as two mirrored inside pocket pieces. I would highly recommend using a thinner fabric for your inside lining pocket pieces. I usually prefer to use cotton lycra, or you could use a double brush poly. It needs to have stretch, but something that's easy to work with in that you can, and that coordinates a little bit. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut out all my pieces, and then I will show you how we start assembling. Okay, so now I have all of my pieces cut out. I have my front top piece, right side out, my right and my left front panel pieces. I have my front panel main and then mirrored lining pieces. So the white is face down and the gray is face up. These are both cut out of cotton lycra as well as the main. I find that I can use cotton lycra for the main panel piece because it has two more layers, so I'm going to be plenty warm with that. And then everything else is a French terry. One thing I am going to do, which is not included in the pattern, but is a pretty simple hack, is I did cut a strip of cotton lycra that I'm going to use as an accent piece along this seam. So this piece is 1¼ inches wide, and it was just the length I had. You would want to cut it at least the length of your diagonal line, but cutting it extra isn't going to be an issue, and I'll show you how to attach that when we get to that step. So now that you have all of those, I took the pieces and I have used my disappearing ink pen, which is purple, and I have marked on each of my panel pieces with a dot where I'm going to start and stop. This is very important that you're accurate. If you are not, then your pocket pieces aren't going to fit together. So make sure to mark everything on your pieces, and then I'm going to show you the next step for assembly. So the first thing that you're going to do in the construction of the pocket piece is attach some interfacing to the pocket front 1 and pocket panel 1 and pocket panel 2. So these with their wrong sides together should mirror, and we're going to attach interfacing to the wrong sides of each of these. This is going to help reinforce the pocket. Now I have talked about this before. I use this tricot interfacing that is 1 inch wide. It came on a roll that fell apart, so I keep it in a bag. I really like this. It came from Warwick. It's easy to use, but you can use any type of interfacing that you want. I probably would avoid using something that is too heavyweight because it can make it difficult to sew through, and it'll actually make your pocket stiff. And since this is a knit fabric, you don't want it to be too stiff. You're just wanting to make sure that this is reinforced here. So I'm gonna cut strips of the interfacing. I need 4 of them to go just past my marked dots. And then I'm going to adhere those to the back, to the wrong side of pocket panel 1 and 2, and I'll be right back. Alrighty, so now that I have the interfacing adhered to the wrong sides of both of these pieces, don't mind the wet spot on this one, I am going to put these pieces right sides together. And I am going to, I find using pins at this point is the most accurate. You want to make sure that your dots are lined up. So if you stick a pin through one dot, it should get through to the other. And then that ensures that those are exactly in the same spot. Alrighty, so I am going to at this point take this over to my sewing machine, and I am only going to sew between the 2 pins on each side. This is going to be with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I will be back stitching at the start and the stop, and I'm going to be using a stretch stitch. You can use a lightning bolt stitch or a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. Just kind of play around with it. It does want a little bit of stretch, but since we have the interfacing already in here, it's not necessary for it to be too much stretch. So I'm going to do that real quick and then show you how that looks. Alrighty, so I have stitched between those 2 dots on either side with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Keep in mind, the pocket panel is the only time we are using a 3/8 inch seam allowance on this pattern. But if you are not using the correct seam allowance, it's not going to work. Make sure to do that. The next thing I'm going to do with my snips is I'm going to cut in to up to, but not through, each of these points where I stopped and started. So it's going to look like this. Do it all around. Alrighty, now I am going to turn this right side out. Okay, so at this point I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine, or to my iron. I am going to pull out the tabs that I've created by snipping. So each of these sections should have a little tab. This will be flat, and then I'll have another little tab. So I'm going to go press this into place. We want a really nice, clean, crisp press. If you haven't snipped far enough, then you might not be able to get these tabs out, so you can just turn it around and snip a tiny bit more. But remember, you do not want to snip through the stitches. So I'll take this over to the iron and then be right back. Alrighty, so this piece is ironed and ready to go. Now we're gonna set it aside and we will move on to the other pieces. So now we are going to take the panel pocket 3rd piece, right side up, and the side pieces. If it's too difficult for you to see where your markings are, you can mark them from the back side, but we are going to put a pin and we're going to mark again where each of those dots are. Now, these pieces do not have any interfacing on them. So don't worry about that portion. Alrighty, now this step might not have been as stated as it is important. This step is very important. I, at this point, want to make sure that my pocket pieces are going to line up correctly and perfectly. So at this here, I actually place my main right on top and make sure that these are right at the intersections. They are, so we're gonna be okay. If they aren't, you can adjust the pins and where you're gonna stitch ahead of time, but they need to be lined up perfectly. So now we're gonna take this piece over to the sewing machine, and I am again going to stitch between these two marks on either side with a stretch stitch at 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'll be right back. Alrighty, so this is done. So this one looks a little bit different. We are not going to clip into this portion. We are actually going to press the sewn section towards the side panel. So I'm going to take this over to my iron and press it flat with the seam pressing towards the side panel on both sides. And then I'll show you how to layer these up and attach the pocket together. Alrighty, so here is the part where we are going to actually assemble the pocket. This is the genius portion of this pattern. So we have the main, the inside panel piece 3 with the side panels attached, laying face up. These have been ironed so that the seam allowance goes towards the side panels. Then we are going to take our main pattern piece, 1 and 2 that are attached together, and we are going to lay it right side up as well. Okay, so these are right sides together. Now, this is where I think people can get confused. We are going to lay these and they're going to nest. So all we need to do is take the side panel piece and swing it up and around our cutout, okay? So we're gonna take this side panel piece, pull it out, up, and around the cutout. And now we're going to bring it back down, line it up, and lay it flat along this edge. Okay. You wanna make sure that your side little notches are in line and attached. And then clip or pin all the way up the sides. Making sure, so there should be 4 layers along this side. Okay, let me see if I can get a close-up of what this looks like here. So this is how this looks inside of here. So I have the gray is the back panel piece 3. The inside of here is the 2 portions of the first and second layers, and then the blue encapsulates it. So you've got all 3 of them hooked together. What we're going to do next is we are going to sew from the bottom up to the pocket and from the top down to the pocket. We're going to go right in line. So this is going to be at a 3/8 inch seam allowance again. What I find though, that when I get to this little portion where the notch is cut out, is I kind of prefer to go a little bit in towards the main panel. This is going to allow that you make sure that it's caught properly and it's not going to pull out. I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to go take this over again with a stretch stitch, 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to do from the bottom to the pocket and from the top to the pocket on each side. I'll do this side, show you how it looks, and then come back with the other. Alrighty, so now that I have done that, I can just, this is what it looks like. I can flip this over, and this is what my new pocket, my pocket looks like completed. Now, if for some reason this didn't catch all the way, you could flip it back over and just do a few more stitches right here to ensure that it's going to catch. Or you can unstitch this and pull this through a little bit tighter when you're pulling. If you're having issues with this, another trick is just to use some tweezers, and as you're sewing, you can pull on just these middle 2 layers so that it ensures that it's pulled out to the seam and it's caught in the layers properly. So all I'm gonna do now is I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to press this seam. You can. Okay, so again, I'm going to stitch from the bottom to the pocket and from the top down to the pocket, making sure that I am grabbing those middle layers and that they get stitched in. Alrighty, so here is what the pocket looks like from the front. So the pockets are located right here. And then here is what the pocket looks like from the back. So the next step is to overcast this seam. So I am going to use my serger, but making sure not to go into the stitch line. So I'm going to go like this along the edge and just serge along this edge just to close it. So I have now finished my lower bodice portion. I have top stitched along the outer seam. You can use a cover stitch or a zigzag stitch, any stretch stitch on your sewing machine if you prefer. That was an optional step. I chose not to do the top stitching on the inner pocket piece. I just prefer it not to be on there. My pocket is done. Now we need to attach the top bodice portion. So if you are choosing to add an accent piece, you would be doing so now. This was my 1 1/4 inch wide cotton lycra that I cut, that I have folded wrong sides together and ironed. I just cut it longer than the seam. There's no real like amount you need to cut it, other than it needs to be at least the length of your diagonal here. And then I am just going to pin it in place. Now, one thing to note is we are done using that 3/8 inch seam allowance. That was only for the pocket panel construction. Going forward for the rest of your Lotte, you're going to use the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you are using a serger, you will not be trimming off anything with your serger. So I have this clipped in place, and then I'm going to lay my upper bodice piece on top of that and line everything up. So this is going to sandwich in this accent piece. So to give you a preview of what it's going to look like, it's going to look like this along here. Now, if you choose not to put an accent piece, that's totally fine. You'll just lay your main bodice right side up and then clip your upper bodice, top bodice piece right side down. If you are using a thick material, I would not recommend adding in this accent piece. Just because there's a lot of layers going on right here. Already there are 3 layers from the pocket plus this upper, so this is going to be 6 layers right here. If I was using something like a quilted knit or probably even the font, I would not recommend adding in an accent. It's just going to be a lot for your seam of added bulk. Now I'm going to take this over to my serger and I am going to serge it with that 1/4 inch seam allowance along here. There should not be anything trimmed off at this point. It's just what the serger does. Since this is a bulkier seam, I have adjusted my differential feed on my serger. So what that means is I have increased the number so it's not quite as wavy. So mine is at 1.3, and that just kind of eliminates the waviness on here. So I'm gonna go over to the serger. I'll be right back. Alrighty, so that's quite a seam you've got there. So that's 6 layers right in there. So all you do now is flip this over and then press. I'm going to go press this with steam. Try to get it evened out. And then I'm also going to trim down the extras. And then if you'd like, you can top stitch along the upper top bodice seam line right along here. This will help keep the extra piece in here from popping up, but it might be difficult since there's so many layers. There are 6 layers in this serge seam, so it might not work on your machine so beautifully. But I am going to go at least press this with steam so that it relaxes it a little bit and gives a different look. But then after that, your top bodice, your front bodice piece is done. The next step that you would do would be to attach your back bodice at the shoulders, add your sleeves, sew up your side seams, and then add your bottom band, and then add on your cowl or your hood. If there's more questions about that process, I can do a video later, but at this point, I'm just gonna do the pressing and then show you the final product.